Okay, so what I want to do with this last piece of this whole thing is I kind of want to do a little bit of post-mortem because as I said, I did not collect any awards, got no love whatsoever, and again, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to. I know that my style of finishing is very different from what I call the ipms style, and that's okay. I didn't really go down there to try and win prizes. I went to have the experience, so that I would be able to do, see the models firsthand, see the show venue firsthand, just get that whole experience IRL, and then also so that I could be a judge and see how that went in actuality. So that was my real purpose. And then it sort of became like this whole thing of proving to myself that I could make that kind of a drive on my own. And collecting prizes was really like the least important thing to me. But I do kind of want to sort of analyze my work relative to the judges' comments that I now have. So let's take a look. Okay, so first of all, a couple of things about the way the judging went. So each team had a sheet, a judge's sheet for the category, and one of the three of us was assigned to be in the scribe and writing down all of the notes on the back of that sheet. And in this case, it was Mark Schachter, but we all pitched in, and he just basically transcribed our comments. But the important thing is that the comments were all basically the strikes, a list of the strikes. That's what he had on his sheet, and I assume that that's what others did as well. I was taking notes on my iPhone and then passing them off to him as far as the flaws go. So, like for example, you can see I wrote that entry 266, his port wing was a little bit high, horizontal stabilizers were not level, and his landing gear were misaligned. And I don't remember which aircraft this was. This number 266 corresponds to the number that the registration guys put on the individual's sheet that was right there with the model. So you can just kind of see 526D, one wheel slightly misaligned. That was actually the Spitfire that got second place. So anyway, that's the kind of things that were on the judge's notes. So having said that, what was on the judge's notes for my little Tamiya Mark I Spitfire were 2 comments only. One of them just said weathering. And this is one of those things that, contributes to me having an even stronger perception that there is, at minimum, a preference for unweathered subjects. I got little pieces of fuzz all over it. I'm glad they didn't notice those. Those are, just stuff that's collected in the cabinet, I guess. Anyway, so weathering. No elaboration, nothing, just weathering. But again, like I said, what's listed on that sheet are what the judges consider to be the flaws. So from that, you can only conclude that the weathering was considered to be a flaw. Now, I will say this, okay? The lighting was an issue, and I've talked about that at several places in this video series. I have to say, my Spitfire was at the end of the table, and it was a little bit darker because our table was kind of over in the corner of the room, nearest to the walls, and it was, I think, a bit darker overall than it was out in the middle of the display area, which was pretty huge. I mean, this is a convention center, civic center kind of thing, so a giant room. But the end of the table that this was on was noticeably darker than the middle of the table. And that gave me problems with several of the subjects that I was trying to judge. And every time I looked over at this thing sitting there, I thought, damn, it just looks kind of dark and shitty. So, maybe that's why they felt like the weathering was a flaw, because, they just couldn't see it well enough. And I'll tell you, I have another anecdote about that here in a second. But the other comment on the judge's notes were that my decals my roundel decals on the wings were not aligned. Now it's kind of funny because these are not decals; they're sprayed on. But here's the flaw. Okay, so if you zoom in, like right there, you can see where that roundel is relative to the aileron cutout, and that's pretty typical of Spitfires. That's, you know, where the top wing roundels go. Now you go over here and you look at this one, and obviously the gap right there at the back between the back edge of the roundel and the aileron cutout is a little bit more on the port wing than it is on the starboard wing. And look, I'm not going to complain about that. I mean, you know, you could say that, all right, they should be the same. Okay, whatever's correct, they should be the same. And so, you know, in terms of markings, that's a strike. I have no heartburn with that. Now, here's what's funny. When we were all done with our work, I asked Mark Schachter to judge this for me. I'm like, you know, this would be stupid not to take advantage of the opportunity. I've got this world-class builder who's a multi-time national winner and a national judge. I want to see what he thinks of this little thing. So he looked at it and he said two things. One is he immediately picked up on the issue that I had right here with the canopy. For anybody who watched the video build series on this thing, you know that I had a little bit of drama right there where I was an idiot and I put the masks on the windscreen before I installed it. And when I installed it, and I use extra thin for that kind of thing, there was a little bit of leakage underneath the tape. I saw it happen. I knew it was going to be an issue. And instead of just, you know, stopping right there and dealing with it, I blew it off because this thing was never going to go to a show as far as I knew at that time, and I felt like it was not bad enough that I wouldn't be able to polish it out later. And honestly, fixing it was going to, if it was really worse than that, fixing it was going to require buying another kit, and I just didn't care enough at the time. So as it turned out, it was a little worse than I thought, but I chose to just polish it. And you can see that there's a little bit of an issue right there in the corner. And like I've said before, Mark Schachter has eagle eyes, and he picked up on that instantly. And that is a totally fair call. That is definitely a strike. What's funny, though, is that the other judges didn't see that or comment on it at all. So, you know, there you go. Now, the other thing that Mark commented on, and this is kind of funny to me. As I've said in several places in this little series, he very much has a style preference for unweathered. And he came back and he said, so your props, they kind of have like some splotches all over them. Like, I think there's like a problem with your finish. And I kind of laughed. I was like, well, that's oil paint work. And he goes, oh, so that was intentional? And I said, yeah, absolutely it is. And I explained to him that, you know, I like to do that. You know, my comment was, well, you know, look, props are not pure black, you know, except the moment that they come out of the box. And what I like to do to illustrate that is I like to do oil paint rendering, and I use a neutral gray, and you know, that's what you're seeing there. And I could tell honestly that just did not compute for him. You know, he just clearly he didn't find any merit in that explanation at all. But again, going back to the lighting issue, I could see why he was not able to see the subtleties there, because even I couldn't, and I knew they were there. So, you know, look, it's not an unfair thing in those circumstances. It's easy to say, well, you should just judge the skill that the weathering is applied and not put your personal preferences on top of it. But if your personal preferences can't be addressed because the lighting is not good enough, then what do, right? I mean, so this is, again, something that Matt McDougall has brought up a number of times. I've said this before in this video series. You know, it may not even be worth doing all of this fancy weathering stuff because nobody's going to be able to see it. The other thing is, I was glad that I chose to do this one with the cockpit closed, because that's another thing. Open cockpit, all those details that you put in there, seat belts, maybe a little bit visible, but the rest of it, you can't see that shit at all under the lighting that they had. So closed canopy, yeah, that to me is the way to go if you're building to a formula to try and do well at an IPMS show, at least if and I can't imagine that the lighting is really any better at any other shows than it was at this one. So, you know, again, it's something to think about in terms of sort of the formula if you're going to try to go win one of these things. Maybe skip all the fancy pants weathering, closed canopy, you know, just stick to super tight paint. Don't take a lot of risks. Now, so here's another thing. This was a little disturbing. This had to get moved, and there was a lady there who happened to be moving them around, and she just reached over and grabbed this thing by the right-hand wing. And I was watching her do this, and I was freaking out, because anybody who knows anything about Spitfires knows that you cannot grab them sorry, I said right wing, I meant left wing. I should have just said port. You cannot grab a Spitfire by the port wing, because that's where, come on camera, focus the fuck up. That's where the pitot tube is. Now, fortunately, it survived her barbarism, but I was not pleased. But yeah, and then of course there's all that work that I did on the belly that obviously totally unable to be seen. But you know, like, it made me glad that I didn't bother doing brake lines on this one, because yeah, you wouldn't even been able to see them. All of this underneath, like the subtlety of the weathering on the tires, yep, completely invisible. You couldn't see it at all. Now, one of the things that we that became very instantly clear was that that construction was going to be first, and we immediately took all of the models and lined them up facing the front edge of the table so that we could have a look head on to see if there were any misalignments of the wings, the horizontal stabilizers, the wheels, any of that shit. So there were no comments about mine, and I'm pretty sure there are no issues, but let's just have a look. I should also say that the instructions from Rob at the judges meeting were, don't use any measuring devices and don't use your flashlights. He wanted everybody to just be dependent on their eyeballs and make it, a level playing field. So now I will say that a number of judges were instantly whipping out their pins, which, had like rubber grips on them or whatever, and had like lines or whatever, and they were instantly doing things like this, taking their pin and holding it up here and going, okay, I see where it is on that side, where it hits the pin on that side, and then if I go over here to this side, yep, hits it in the same spot, they're level. So yeah, either they didn't hear the instructions about that, or they just didn't care, or it was just habit or whatever. But that whole thing was clearly in play. So, all right, well, I'm at my workbench and I don't have to follow anybody's rules. So I'm going to get out the ultimate authority, digital calipers. And let's just do this real quick. Okay, so I've measured that one. I went to where that panel line comes out to the wingtip, and I've locked the calipers at 32.76. So now let me turn it around and put the corner There is a little bit of a difference at that panel line corner. So let me see what it measures then. If I loosen this up, it's just a little bit lower. Okay, 32.76 versus 32.29. So it looks to me like there's maybe a ½ millimeter of difference there. That's fair. Now, if I line the wheels up with the relative to the grid lines on my cutting mat, and that's a good thing to do, because that helps you with the whole eyeballing thing. And if I scoot back over here far enough to where I can see both wings, and I line them up by eye with a grid line that's behind the wingtips, I can't see a difference with my eyes. I mean, ½ millimeter is not impossible to see. Let me try a different pair of glasses. ½ millimeter is not impossible to see. Okay, actually, if I really try hard, yep, I can just barely make out that slight difference, but it's hard. I don't think I could have made out that difference on the show table. Now I'm looking at the back end, and actually, see, it all depends on whether or not the whole thing is lined up straight this way, like if the yaw is correct. The only way that trick works, where you're visually lining up with the grid lines, is if the thing is lined up, straight north and south as well. And it's so, I mean, you're just really getting into something that's very difficult to truly see with your eye. But the bottom line is, these wingtips are within about a ½ millimeter of being the same height out here at the tip. So let's see what the horizontal stabilizer measurements look like, if I can do that, because that was really the most common flaw with all of the ones that had a strike against them. Okay, so right there where the edge of the elevator meets the tail plane, 18.97 millimeters. Let's see what it looks like on the other side. Okay, all right, so I did this a couple of times, but at any rate, there you go, 18.8 on that side. But here's the problem that I'm sure a lot of you already recognize, that when you're doing it this way with a depth gauge, there's error introduced in whether or not you've got it standing straight up. So this really, honestly, is not the best tool. The ideal thing would be a square like this itty bitty machinist square that had graduations along the edge. That would be the ideal thing. Have to have it on both sides so that you could, measure it and then flip it around and have marks on both sides. I might try to find one, because that would be a big help when you're building. But that's the deal. It's got to be the same. Now, in lieu of that, let me see if I've got a ruler here that'll do it. Okay, got this Masterpiece Models ruler. Now, the problem with this is, this helps because it's clear, but you don't have really fine gradations on it. So you have to kind of go, all right, well, that's pretty close to the mark that's just below the 3. But now when you flip it around to get to the other side, you're going to have some sort of distortion issues, but it is clearly high on that side. It's right at the 3 on that side, and about a millimeter low on that side. So I would have bet money that this thing did not have any of those issues that were getting measured, but the ruler doesn't lie. It clearly does. And none of that got listed on the judge's sheet. And now that I'm looking at this thing, just eyeballing it from the front, I can see it plain as day, and I'm really embarrassed that I didn't catch that when I built the thing, because I worked pretty hard to get those level. But yeah, it's out. It's definitely out. And it's out by a similar amount that most of the ones we saw on the judging tables were out by. Typically they were all less than a millimeter. So there you go. That's the hard truth about this one. So if I were having to judge this one based on the sort of paradigm at play on Saturday, I don't think I would have picked up the wingtip issue. I certainly would have seen the horizontal stabilizer issue. I would have had to give it 1 strike for that. Now let me look at the wheels. No issue on the wheels. They both have a bit of that characteristic Spitfire angle, but I do feel like they're not exactly equal. I feel like the starboard wheel is kicked out a little bit more. I can see it. And I'm pretty sure a guy with eyeballs like Mark Schachter would have seen it. But this one's an easy one to check. Let's just throw a flat surface up against it and see how the gap compares. So a little bit of an angle on that side, and flip it around here, and yep, there's definitely a little bit more of an angle on the port side. So the wheels slightly not equal, and I think I would have seen that on Saturday. So I would have had to give myself two construction strikes on those merits. And it is what it is. The only question becomes, philosophically, if you feel like those 2 construction strikes eliminate this from contention as a model worthy of placing at the top of its category. And according to the ipms paradigm, it absolutely eliminates it from contention, because with 2 strikes, there's no way that this one could have been looked at as a potential winner. And really, I would have seen the 3rd strike as well with this glue issue right here. I mean, that would have been it right there, because like on my side of the table, the winner had 0 strikes, and it was the only one that had 0 strikes. And then there were quite a few that had only 1 strike, and then there were only a couple that had 3 strikes. So actually, mine, 3 strikes, you're out, buddy. This would not have even been close to being in contention under those terms. Okay, I just discovered that everything I said about the Phantom, yeah, I didn't have the recorder on, so I'm going to do that all again. But I'm going to try not to spend as much time on this one. Looks like it's got a little fly speck on it right there. Anyway, the judge's notes about the Phantom, there were 2 things. They said there were problems with the clear parts. They said cloudy canopy. And they said that the horizontal stabilizers were uneven. So let's look at the canopy problems first. there are definitely problems with the clear parts. There is no doubt about that, and I'll tell you the reasons why. And you can see that they are a bit foggy in a couple of places, and the real offensive thing is that bit of flurm right there on the dash. And funny story, I mean, this is pretty much why those parts are so foggy, is because when I took the masking off after all this paint work, months and months and months, there was a shit ton of flurm up here on the dash. And it was just all shavings from all the work that I had done to get the seamless intakes, the resin intakes to fit, and it was terrible. And I could not shake them out to get them to fall down into the floor. They just were stuck there. So I started doing crazy shit. I was still able to get at the floor of the cockpit at that point. I forget exactly how it worked. I think it was because since this thing is in flight, I hadn't put the landing gear door on yet, and I didn't even have a landing gear bay in there. So I was able to drill a hole in the floor of the cockpit and reach a wire in there, you know, like you do when you're trying to unlock a car, and get some of those bits of flurm out, but obviously not all of them, because then what I tried was I literally squirted water inside the cockpit. All this was covered with clear flat lacquer, so I knew I wasn't going to have any issue with fucking up my paint. I thought, oh, fuck it. I'll just flood the inside of that thing with water and see if I can wash it out. So I had water inside the cockpit, and I was shaking it like a madman, and I actually got most of the rest of the flurm out, but obviously it left that one bit right there, and it made the whole underside of the canopy a bit, you know, dingy looking, and I'm sure that's what they were picking up on. But there's another even worse issue with this canopy that you can only see in the right light. So I'll see if I can get the camera angled correctly so that you can. There it is, right there. So if you look at the lower right hand corner, if it'll stay focused, if you look at the lower right hand corner right here, come on, focus up. Okay, there it is, right there. It only shows up at the exact right angle. When I put the canopy on this thing, it really did not fit perfectly. It had a larger gap on the right-hand side than it did on the left-hand side, and I had to use a clamp to close it up and get it to fit tight, and the result was that right there is one of a bunch of stress fractures that I didn't find until I took the masking off. And at that point, it was like, fuck it. You can only see it from certain angles, and fixing it would have meant buying another kit, sawing this canopy off, because it is very seriously glued on there with Tamiya extra thin and clamped on, and there you can really see them starting to show up when I move the camera around. Anyway, it was going to be, I was going to have to buy another kit. I just was like, fuck it, I'm not going to worry about that. Anyway, let's take a look at the tail planes. Now, this thing, when it's on its display, is at a compound angle where it's climbing and banking. And, you know, the horizontal stabilizers on a Phantom are anything but horizontal. They're at about 120 degrees relative to the vertical stabilizer. So eyeballing that angle is next to impossible. Now, if I believed that it was sitting level on this fixture, and it definitely is not. I've already looked, and I can see that the vertical stabilizer is tilted over to the right a little bit. If I believed that they were level, then I could measure from the bench top to the bottom of each stabilizer, but can't really do that. The only hope that I sort of have of checking this is to measure from the top of the vertical stabilizer to the tip of the horizontal sort of stabilizer. And I really am loath to get anywhere near this thing because I don't want to break it yet again. But in going from there to there, from the 6 to the 2, it comes to just short of the mark that's right before the 2. So let's spin it around and see what we get on the other side. Except this time I'll go from the 2 right there and it is clearly off by about 1/8 of an inch. That's what those marks are, about 1/8 of an inch. So yeah, they're not equal. And that's the important thing, is that they be equal regardless of what the angle is. So, you know, good eye to the judge who spotted that at the weird angle. That's a totally fair call. So this thing has 2 strikes against it, and in a category that was full of Tamiya F14s, which, let's face it, it's tough to screw those things up. 2 strikes, you know, is easily enough to put it out of contention for anything. Okay, so last but not least, let's have a look at the 40. Now this one, I said I worked hard to make sure that like the basics were correct on that Spitfire, but the truth is I didn't do anything extra. I just kind of counted on the Tamiya stuff to be correct and, you know, eyeballed it and felt okay about it. But this one I blocked up on a steel plate, you know, and did all the things. So we'll take some measurements on this one, but even if they were even if they proved to be incorrect, that didn't show up on the judge's notes, and they wouldn't have been able to tell because it was up on the ridiculous rotisserie display stand. So even though it's not in flight per se the way the Phantom is, it kind of, I think, you know, kind of ends up being that way because it's not sitting on the ground where you can sort of look to see how high up a wingtip is from the deck. And I also kind of think, and this has been sort of confirmed by several people, that threw it off. Like the Phantom, there's no doubt that because it was the only in-flight thing, because they don't have a separate in-flight category, that because it's going up against aircraft that are sitting on the ground that are much more easy to scrutinize in terms of those, you know, characteristic fundamentals, that the Phantom was at a bit of a disadvantage, and the comment was that this one was as well, being up on its elevated display stand, and I think that's a thing. I don't know that it would have done any better sitting on the tabletop, but you know, who knows. At any rate, I'll take those measurements. But first, let's talk about the judge's comments. There were 2 comments, and again, this is pretty funny. One comment was weathering pronounced. And it's like, yeah, and obviously, I hope it's pronounced. That's the way it's supposed to be. So, but again, you know, those comments are supposed to be the lists of the issues. And okay, I guess it's an issue. And I was told by somebody who happened to be close by later and overheard a couple of judges talking about this, and one of them was questioning whether or not it would be realistic for an aircraft to be this weathered. Which, you know, I won't rant about that. And the other judge was like, no, you got to look at the skill that the weathering is done, which I was grateful for that. But obviously it didn't make any difference because, yeah, no prizes here. The other comment was that there was paint missing down to bare plastic on the back edge of the windscreen. And that is just not the case. Again, we'll just get in here and we'll take a really, really close look at it. But as you can see, there is no paint missing there. What is there is some painted on chipping. But you can also see why, you know, like with the lighting conditions being what they were, you know, you just might make that mistake. So I can't harsh on the guy for thinking that, but you know, it's unfortunate that that would have gone against it as a strike when it was in fact not the case. Okay, so that's pretty much that. But just out of curiosity, I want to see how the measurements do look on this to see if now, you know, nearly 6 months later, if they are still as good as I remember them being. One issue that I did have was in the was with the tail wheel. It was a little out of whack, and Justin Lentz, who's been an aircraft judge, actually picked up on that when I posted photos of this thing in SMCG, and he was right. It was a little bit out of whack, and I spent some time fixing it because I hope I didn't say nose wheel, the tail wheel, whatever. I spent some time fixing it because, again, I knew this one was going to go to this show, and I wanted to make sure that that was not going to be a deal breaker. So the tail wheel, at least, I mean, it still looks a little weird because it's also turned a little bit. It's just one of those things that's just not going to be perfect. And I'm pretty sure that it probably would get called out as a strike. I'll show you here. You can kind of see what I mean. When you look at it from that side, it does look a little out of whack. But when you look at it from the back, well, the camera's not going to help me out a whole lot with that. Anyway, when you look at it from the back, it's straight up and down. But because of the fact that it's turned a little bit relative to the center line of the fuselage, the angle makes it look like it's still crooked. That's my story anyway. I'm sticking to it. Anyhow, I'm going to measure. Okay, so I got this ruler out. This is the Masterpiece Models thing, and you can see it's scaled. So I'm going to use this, and it looks like, based on this scale, that to the center line of the wingtip out there, that it is right at 135 1/72nd scale feet to that wingtip. And now let's see, when we flip it around, if we can get a good look at it. And it is maybe 137 1/72nd scale feet. Basically, the difference in those wingtips is one of these smallest hash marks, so about a millimeter. So a millimeter difference in height across the 15 inches of wingspan there. I certainly can't see it with my naked eye, and I don't think that it would show up on the tables that way. Now let me do the same exercise with the tail plane. Let's see what we get. So we'll go to the edge of the elevator there. Looks like right at just underneath 80 1/72nd scale feet. Yeah, clearly I think I need to get a height gauge. Is what I need. All right, and right at 80. Yep, right at 80 of the scale feet. I think the difference between the two is one half of these hash marks, so a half millimeter about. So about 20 thousandths difference. And again, I can't pick it up. I can't pick it up with my unassisted eyeball. So I feel pretty good about that. I would not have seen either of those flaws on the tables Saturday. Now let me see if I can, I don't know if it's even possible to get my camera around here to an angle that would show the wheels, but why not? Give it a try. Okay, so there we go, front wheels. And you know, the camera lens doesn't help you out because it's got, you know, there's the wide angle effect there. So let's get out a measuring device, and again, it's hard with the camera angle being what it is, but you can see there's no daylight between the block and the wheel. That one is, we'll call it straight up and down. And let's see how this one fares. So slide that over there. And again, you can see there's no daylight between the block and the wheel. So I think I would have to call that wheel straight as well. And the important thing is that they're both the same. So there we go. I feel like that my claim that this one doesn't have build flaws is pretty close to true. I mean, when I say that, the caveat is within the detectable range of the instruments used at the show, which were eyeballs and the occasional ink pen. Okay, so there you have it, the down and dirty nitty-gritty analysis of my Model Fiesta entries. And I hope you found this informative and sort of interesting. If you're looking at competing in an IPMS show, this will maybe give you a better idea of what it takes to do well, even though I did not do well. For me, this was satisfying because again, even though I was not really worried about collecting any awards, I'm still interested in knowing, what the punch list was and how my work stacked up under that particular system. So for me, this is informative as well. I've learned some things, and this whole exercise has been really, for me, super educational and informative. And while it's given me a little bit of some new insight about the actual process of judging, it hasn't really changed my perception of the IPMS thing. Like I said before, I still believe that there is a distinct preference for a particular style of build within IPMS, at least as far as aircraft goes, and that is a relatively clean thing with no weathering, and that weathering may in fact just confuse the issue, so maybe there's a reason for that. I mean, who knows? I've even speculated that maybe that IPMS style, if you want to call it that, has evolved over the years because it actually still looks pretty good under shitty lighting. I mean, that's a possible reason. But at any rate, I've learned a lot. It's been good fun, and hopefully, me passing all this on to you guys is, informative. Well, that was typical of Rube Goldberg Enterprises. My card ran out of space right as I was literally about to say. If you've watched this entire adventure, I really appreciate it, as always, and much love.